Welcome to Friday night's video and our second master series. This, I do believe, this 35th video in our second master series. And the second video talking about impulse and frequency response metering. Now, I wanted to talk about something after the intro to try to relay how important the subject is to some problems with this. Now, the problems with this is that a real expensive piece of equipment could be able to separate a whole lot of things happening in audio that's been convolved onto it. Some things can't. Now, an example of that is RX6 trying to remove impulse response reverberation effects from a piece of audio. Now that piece of software is designed to try to single that information out and try to remove some of it to clean things up, which is a huge development. I mean, it's fairly new, but it's a work in progress, and they've got it the door open, so it's obviously going to improve more and more and more as they refine it. But this is a huge problem. The first problem is when we're talking about this, as we go through, we're going to take a look at a couple things. The first thing that I really want to relate this to you is problems that we're having with it. The first problem is sound. Let's say this is a first problem. Well, let's say the first problem is VSTs or any patch or thing that's been sub-created that you have no control of or have no idea what's been put on it, and trying to analyze what that is, and or use something like RX6 to remove some of it, to clean it up some so that it doesn't have as much, impulse response or frequency response effect on the sound for its application, which is going to be done with equalization and is going to be done with something like RX6 that can remove some of that from it, which is very difficult. But analyzing it, there are ways to do it, but it's very much questionable how accurate your analysis can be. And another question of it is when you're doing like vocals. Let's say that I've got 50 different microphones. All of them are going to have a different frequency and impulse response built into the circuitry. That's just part of the product. Now, that can be also interfaces, any piece of hardware you have, and software plugins. Sometimes a chorus or something like that will actually affect the impulse and frequency response. That's sometimes very difficult to see how much it has affected it, but sometimes it's very audible. Does that make sense? Like, how do I pick it apart to find out what it did to it? Now, as far as like vocals and things like that and trying to figure out how much you can clean them up, when I talked about in my first master series about getting that test capture, and some staccato things, duh, 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 so that you can, part of the analysis besides testing processing on it and things like that, is you can see, just like with a drum hit, if I got a kick drum and I've got it, whether I recorded it or it's a VST instrument, bam, I can take that one kick drum, that hit, and I can go around and look at it and try to cut down the frequency response, the impulse response, by using equalization and editing the actual file itself, or throwing it in RX6 to remove some of that. And I can also see, how far of a tail it has on it, how much, other things have been convolved on it. Can sometimes be very, very difficult because you're looking at a drum hit that has all this impulse frequency response stuff involved onto it, and knowing what it's supposed to sound like clean, totally clean, like in an anechoic chamber before it has any of that stuff on it. So getting prints of things that are as clean as possible, like you've got a mic, checking your mics where they're just isolated, to where there's no impulse frequency response coming from them except for the vocalist and whatever's on the microphone that's affecting the frequency response, or any other equipment that's going through. This can be a huge project, but it can be just like we talked about getting prints of things that we're looking at, when we're looking at the spectrum, like we talked about spectrometers and with the oscilloscope. It's the same kind of concept, because this concept gets so deep, I could make a whole series on this, of taming that and working with it and learning about it and knowing when it's good or bad. That can be very complicated. So, those test captures we talk about that can really help you determine whether or not that microphone's working well, not only by listening to it, but by looking at the spectral content, which is an affected sound that has a frequency and impulse response on it that's, can be seen on the spectrum and on the oscilloscope to evaluate it. That's very hard to evaluate. And then I just want to go down to see what's going on. Where, you can take a look at that, what's going on, almost like a drum hit. Does that make sense? Because like things like drum hits, it's one sound and then backed off. You can really kind of get a little bit better understanding visually of what that might look like with different microphones in different rooms and with different reverberations on them and all kinds of things. So it's a very complicated subject. And to get into it too deep is, I'm not sure. I thought about it and I thought I could make 500 videos on this. I mean, I could. I know I could. So it's better to get you to understand that the information's there. And as you study impulse and frequency response is better, looking at it, we're going to spend most of our time looking at frequency responses. We're going to be looking at like impulse responses and then starting to try to evaluate what that is and evaluate the frequency response content that's inherent in it from the room, because any room is going to have an impulse and frequency response on it. And same with the microphone. It's a piece of equipment. When you sing into it, the room is going to have an affected frequency response, and the microphone is going to imprint a different frequency and impulse response that it can allow to go through its system that is going to affect what it originally is trying to capture. So it's basically almost like processing. Any different microphone you have or some other piece of hardware or some VST instrument or some plug-in is going to possibly affect the frequency and impulse response by doing things to it, either boosting it in some areas or subtracting it in some areas because of the algorithm or the electronics. And it can get very, very complicated to where you really need to understand that is happening. You need to study the impulse frequency response of your microphones, any equipment that you have, any VST instruments you have. Ask about those things so that you can evaluate how it's affecting something. Because, I mean, it's a very simple thing to relate to that Bob's got two $50,000 microphones. Now, we all don't have $50,000 microphones. I know I do not, because I can't afford a $50,000 microphone. But I'd gladly take one if you want to send me one. But he's got two different ones. Myself, I'd be happy with either one of them, and I'd probably fix any issue I have. But he's got two of them. He's a lucky guy, and he's like, he's got Bob in there, and Bob's singing through one of them, and he says, nope, and he goes to the other one. Or he's got 4 or 5 of them. Now, they are directly affecting, first of all, he's in a beautiful room in this beautiful studio that has been constructed with acoustics in mind, and on top of it he's choosing a different microphone that's going to read that in possibly a different way, a da. So you understand a whole lot of that has to do with frequency and impulse response. There's also issues about saturation and distortion and noise and things like that. Those pieces of equipment and the room itself are going to add to the sound of Bob or whoever's singing into it or in the room, but those are huge factors that those impulse frequency responses are going to drastically be affected by any piece of hardware, software, the room, or anything like that. So it's a huge subject, and it's not one that's easily answered by a couple videos I'm going to put on. It's much better for me to show you some things about impulse frequency responses, what's happening there, and for you to be able to see the concept so that it becomes very important for you to study these things on any piece of equipment you have, in any room you have, and something simple like people sell pieces of software for room analysis and room treatment and acoustic treatment and all kinds of stuff that have a huge impact. There's some videos on my channel in the first Master Series about dealing with some of those issues without having to mess with your room too much, because sometimes it really doesn't have it really sometimes doesn't matter. If you're a really good audio engineer, if the room has problems or the piece of equipment has problems, you can probably fix it in the DAW as an audio engineer for the most part. Sometimes not. You get a really super cheap microphone that sounds like, just is, from Play School, that it's very unlikely you're going to make that sound like it's a $50,000 microphone at Sony Music Records. So, but you can clean it up a lot as a really good audio engineer to where if it's a pretty decent microphone that you wouldn't even tell, there's no way you could tell the difference between that $50,000 microphone and that $300 microphone that you got from, Sennheiser. There's no way that I know that if you're that good of an audio engineer, no audio engineer would be able to tell the difference of them. But that is part of becoming that next level master audio engineer and understanding what the microphone does to it so you can compensate for it in the studio and with your audio engineering skills. So that's a huge subject again. So basically this subject gets really complicated, but we are going to focus on looking at these things and analyzing them, and then we'll talk about its effect on different sounds so that you can possibly start to pick it out and see what it's doing to it and understand how difficult that can be sometimes and how slight little changes can drastically alter the sound. Just a little teeny bit of reverb from some plugin you got that you don't know what it's doing to it exactly at all in no way, shape, or form can sometimes have a drastic effect on the impulse response, the frequency response, its summed properties, its convolved properties, and how it's doing that, and the algorithm that causes it to do that, it can get just really complicated. So without you being a top level audio engineer with audio and engineering skills, that trying to teach it to you, it's going to be most functional for you as in audio engineering, trying to become a master audio engineer in the music production area, that you're dealing with something that's NASA kind of stuff, and I'm trying to relate it to you to where you can improve, your abilities and knowledge of it, but not have to go to Berkeley for the next 15 years to be able to work at NASA to understand a whole lot of the properties of things that are happening, which is kind of difficult because it affects everything you do, and it's everywhere on all kinds of stuff you do in the studio. So just understanding it's happening is a step up to help make you that next level master audio engineer, because you'll know what's happening and you'll know there are steps you can take to either fix the issue or precautions to take before the issue is imprinted on audio, and ways that you can reduce it or expand upon it or change it, the impulse and the frequency response and how it's affecting the audio and what ways it's affecting the audio, and in different areas how you can affect it. Even impulse response, I can go in here and cut part of this one out or reduce it, and I can reduce this one, I can reduce this one, I can reduce that one, reduce that one, put the gain up on this one here and put the gain up right here. It's going to totally change the dang sound of that impulse response and how it affects your piece of audio. It just is. So, and it looks funky because sometimes it doesn't look like you would think that it's the echo of the room or the imprint of the room on there. And it looks like gobbledygook sometimes if you don't really understand that. It's really hard to understand exactly what happened there without being in the room, that an acoustical engineer explaining to you the acoustical properties of that room and why exactly every one of these little points are on here, or why they're on there and where they came from exactly. That is a huge topic and very difficult to try to teach, and especially every property in the room and the materials in the room, besides just the vocalist and the microphone or whether they were capturing with it, how it affected the sound to come up with a unique frequency response that's inherent on this file that you're trying to convolve onto, into your convolution reverb. So, to some people it might be like, well, that's ridiculous, dude. I have to go to NASA, I want to make music. Well, you're going to want to learn something about this so that, as you're using these things in different pieces of equipment, that it's going to better help you to take precautions when you're using pieces of equipment or software or recording. It's going to help you when you're analyzing things to understand what's going on. It's going to better help you to fix things as you're going along as best as you can with an informed, knowledgeable perspective that these things are drastically affecting your piece of audio. Whereas before you might have thought, that's ridiculous, I know that's not affecting my piece of audio that much. And I go, yeah, it is, bro. Not only is that, every piece of dang hardware you got and software you got and the room itself and the microphone and everything, and is affecting that whole piece of audio before you even hardly even touch it. And there are things you can do if you think about it and use your brain to understand it's being affected to take precautions so that you have better stuff to work with and you're better able to fix things, repair things, enhance things, and all kinds of things because of how much it's drastically altering things to repair and enhance. So I really hope you enjoyed this second video and understand the importance of and difficulties that we're going to be looking at and we'll be taking at the responses in the next video. See you in the next video.